Well, thanks for joining us today in the continuing series, Speaking to Hispanics, Thought Exchange. Today we're going to be taking on the subject of the total market pendulum, which we'll get to in a moment. But first, by way of introductions, Lucia Balas Trainer, EVP of the Hemisphere Media Group. They own and operate 5 cable TV networks in the United States.
Right.
Armanda Sarlosa, President and CEO of the Access Agency, a multicultural marketing communications agency. Patricia Testa, Managing Partner of D2H Partners, and myself, Marcelino Millares, also Managing Partner of D2H.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
Glad you're here.
So let's jump in. The total market pendulum. What we want to explore today in general is the swing, if there is one, between clients who have to decide on taking a total market approach to the Hispanic market and hiring agencies that do just that, or clients who want to take a more segmented Hispanic-specific approach and hiring agencies who do that. Is there a pendulum? Is there not a pendulum? Should there be one? So let's sort of start with the question of what is a total market approach when it comes to addressing the U.S. Hispanic market within a general market context.
Sure. So I think there's a big gap between the way total market is defined versus how total market has been interpreted. And I think there is such a variance in terms of the way it's being interpreted by different clients or different advertisers. I think that what was meant to, total market was really meant to sort of say you need to have an integrated approach to multicultural, and it has to start from inception. So from, if it's an insights that you've uncovered that drives your marketing strategy, all the way through investment in media. I think it was interpreted differently by different companies, and I don't know if this is what you're referring to in terms of the pendulum, but I think it's gone from where niche used to be, I think, something that more and more companies would do to engage this population, to now it's a total market, meaning let's cast a Latino and or a multicultural audience and approach it as total market. At least that's my view.
So is it agency driven or is it client driven?
I think it's both.
Yeah, I think it's both too. I mean, I think the agency's responsibility is to try to interpret the data and try to figure out exactly what the proper approach is in the marketplace. But I think that as an agency, we are really bound to to where the client wants to take the brand. I mean, I think when you look at this, you have to understand that it's never a linear type of proposition. Every market is different, but the reality is that we have the Hispanic marketing has evolved over the last few years, and we've gone from pure adaptation of general market work to a cross-cultural strategy, which takes into consideration some cultural insights, but probably not quite enough, to where we are today, where again, on paper, academically, it speaks very well to looking at the market from a total market perspective. But how that actually then is actually put executed and put into work is really a different proposition, because a lot of times total market is based on creating efficiency. And if that's your sole motivator, that's fine, but that's not really going to drive ultimately brand engagement for a client, because you're missing the critical piece, which is some sort of cultural insight that allows you to connect all these markets together in a holistic way.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but what I've heard from our agency partners, I have more of the media perspective, is the clients don't want to pay for the expertise. So again, going back to efficiencies, what has happened is, why are we going to invest in resources that are dedicated multicultural expertise if that's not what the clients are going to pay for or even demanding?
Yeah. So are you saying that then this total market approach doesn't monetize the market to its fullest, right?
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think so. I mean, I always tell my clients, if you're really looking for an opportunity to fill in the gap in terms of profit, in terms of sales, and even awareness, you really need to be looking at the multicultural audience, because that's an underinvested audience with significant purchasing power, but we don't actually put enough resources behind that investment. And you might say, I'm looking for efficiencies, But I'm actually not looking for efficiencies. I respect the idea of efficiencies, but I'm looking for growth opportunities. I'm figuring out a way to be able to close the gap for you so that you can actually look at the market in a more holistic way. I tell people, example, you come to Los Angeles, for example, where we are today, and Los Angeles is 60% multicultural or even more than that. If your campaign doesn't lean in on multicultural from the start, you're missing the opportunity. You're not really tapping the marketplace. You're recognizing there's a gap and you're not really marketing towards that gap.
And when you're talking multicultural, are you talking, as Lucia said, casting, or are you talking media?
I mean, I'm talking from both perspectives. I mean, I think just to look at one piece versus the other, frankly, is a disservice to the client. I mean, I think you need to calibrate it all together so that it really creates the proper efficiency in the market, but at the same time, delivers on that cultural promise.
So our efficiencies, our marketing efficiencies and cultural insights sort of diametrically opposed to each other. Because if you're targeting efficiencies, which theoretically means that you're going to look for efficiencies in creative and messaging, you're going to try to find common messages for everybody, you're going to try to cast appropriately and creative for everybody, and then you're going to buy media based on some minimum reach and frequency levels, right? That's where the efficiencies are coming. Yeah. But if you do that, aren't you almost by choice, conscious or unconscious, deliberately excluding the multicultural consumer who watches all or mostly, in our case, Spanish language media?
I mean, I don't necessarily think that they have to be, diametrically opposed. I think if we have an agreement with clients from the very beginning that we're going to try to calibrate this to reach the broadest piece of the marketplace, you can create efficiencies in terms of, with that understanding, efficiencies in media, in production, and any other kind of branding engagement. The work that we do, for example, for Kaiser takes that into consideration. Kaiser is very aware of what their patient census is. They're 70% multicultural. So everything that we do for Kaiser comes through the lens of that notion. And so when we come up with the cultural insight, it's based on something that is a shared value across different markets. Anything you do in the general market cannot work against you in the Hispanic market, and vice versa. And so when you plan the media, you also create those efficiencies by looking at it as a holistic perspective as opposed to just some segmented, siloed approach.
I think the examples like Kaiser, honestly, are less and less.
I feel few and far between, right?
Yes, and the other thing, in terms of efficiencies, and maybe this is also another way that we're looking at efficiency. So what I kept hearing from clients is we need to use the same metrics as we use in the general market. And the best-in-class metrics are, Nielsen, and we need to use them the same way that we use them in the general market. So I'm going to give you an example of what happened with Guapa America. So Guapa America is aimed at the Puerto Rican segment. That Puerto Rican segment now totals almost 6 million. In the continental US, almost double the population of the island. So when we first launched Guapa America, we paid $1 million for Nielsen because we went to all of the agencies and clients and said, you need to get Nielsen for us to even consider Guapa America. A year and a half later, I would go to the agencies and the buyers, and more of the buyers are not multicultural experts. And I would say, they would say, well, we ranked Guapa America, and Guapa America fell to 112 of 112 Nielsen-rated stations. And I say, well, of course. It's in 5.3 million homes, and it's Puerto Rican households. How about you filter the Nielsen metrics by Puerto Rican households? Oh, we don't do that. We don't do it that way. We got to do it the way the clients. Then other times I would go to X agency and client, they would say, we have a 60 million household metric. We can't go after, we can't advertise in networks. Right. And I would say, well, how many Hispanic households are there? There's like 17 million. Who's in 60 million homes when they're not, So I think part of the efficiencies or the metrics is also, okay, well, if you don't use the metrics that we're using in the general market, then we can't do business.
Wasn't P&G that said that households don't watch TV? It's people who watch TV when they drop the household paradigm?
Yeah. I mean, they're looking at psychographics and they're all analytics. I actually, think P&G is one of the companies that is doing it right in Hispanic. They even buy little networks like ours. So I think P&G is one of the few that does take a different approach in terms of multicultural.
That's where I was going before when I coming back to the idea that it's insight versus efficiency. In that example, you could, for very valid reasons, make a decision to deliberately leave out 6 million viewers of Guapa TV and miss whatever insights could have maximized or optimized that particular audience, because it all depends on what your reach and frequency goals are. I going back a few years when Nielsen decided to bundle Hispanic and general market universes in one, I wonder if they did a disservice from that perspective, because you no longer looked at the Hispanic market on its own merits.
Okay.
And I think with valid reason, they're part of the whole. We haven't brought up that many agencies believe and clients believe that Hispanics are watching general market TV too.
Yes.
But the reality is that there's 30 or 40 million souls in this country who really prefer to watch Spanish, will see your English language commercial 50 times and be moved by the 3 times that they see it in Spanish, if they see it. So how this is why we bring up the subject of the pendulum. Is there a reason for clients to start sort of unbundling or redefining total market to mean we want to reach the total market as opposed to sort of tactically saying we're talking to the total market?
Right. I think from my perspective, I think that pendulum is beginning to shift a little bit. I think what's happened with total market is that because it's, as we said, it's more of an efficiency play from my perspective, they've lost out on some of the cultural universal truths that need to be applied to the creative process to be able to engage a consumer and a customer. And so I think brands are realizing that they can't just swap out cultural insight for efficiency and still deliver on that promise. So I think you are going to see more of a renewed interest in making sure that whatever you put out in terms of content, that it speaks to that lifestyle. Great, let's drive the efficiency, but let's make sure that we don't do that at the cost of a cultural truth.
I'm in complete agreement. I think total market started with what they did with Nielsen. And it was actually, I think that was more driven by,
networks.
By thank you. Because you know what, and by the way, in a way, rightly so, right? So they kept being marginalized and siloed, and they were starting to beat the general market networks in prime time. And then, so they said, why shouldn't we be then considered along with everybody else? This was also back in the days, and this is decades ago, when Mr. Parencio, who was heading up the company, said, I want the sales force to be not Latino. I want the sales force to be American, because the people that we should be talking to are the people that are not buying us. So it did start, I think, years ago, but now all the metrics, everything is built towards these efficiencies and total market. And as I said, niche, which is all of the networks that I handle, has almost become like a dirty word. And what I'm finding is that outside of the P&Gs and maybe 5 key accounts, I'm starting to talk to direct response clients, DTC brands, and people that are saying, you know what, the Hispanic market is our biggest opportunity, and I'm willing to not necessarily rely on just Nielsen, but have our own attribution model. So the pendulum is swinging in the sense that I think some of the more traditional companies are sort of being left behind, while the ones that are developing their own attribution models based on results, based on qualified prospects, etc., are seeing that there is an opportunity there.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point, because you talked about cultural insights, which as immigrants acculturate, they're by definition adhering more and more to whatever those cultural insights might be that we find. But in the world of DR or ROI marketing or performance marketing, you absolutely cannot use a total market approach, because you're leaving money on the table. There's absolutely no way to say, I've talked to everybody, when you haven't bought enough Spanish, whether it's at a network level or at a cable level or at a niche level. There's no way.
We had a client, an online retailer, very successful, that was doing total market approach. And they found that they were under delivering on Hispanic. They approached us. we scaled from approximately a $20,000 buy on a weekly basis to about 115, 120. Their Hispanic consumer base jumped accordingly because we're doing basically the RTV.
Well, we actually started talking to the market.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Right, exactly.
They were very happy, very successful. They had it, but not happy with their general market. They hired a general market agency. They RFP'd. The business was awarded to a huge agency that believes in the total market approach. The Hispanic market has been underserved ever since, and their Hispanic business has dropped considerably.
Yeah, there's countless
That's a fun
examples.
pendulum.
There's countless examples of that. I mean, I have a client in the grocery space that operates here in California, and they were using the total market approach, and they recognize the same thing, that in some of these markets that are highly Hispanic, Spanish language immigrant populations, they weren't driving the numbers. And so they actually orchestrated a campaign, a significant campaign, a $3 to $5 million campaign in those individual markets, and sales have just increased. It ballooned double digits, and then we sustained that over the course of 3 years. Why? Because we started talking to that consumer. It doesn't mean that we stopped doing the rest of it.
Correct.
We kept doing the rest of it, but you had a very specific, tailored, integrated approach into those markets, and it drove sales.
This goes back to something that you probably remember at Univision many, many years ago. We used to say that TV basically bridged the informational gap that Hispanic consumers have. And in addition, yes, commercials are commercials, but they also supply a service.
Yeah.
They open the consumer's eyes to the opportunities that they have that otherwise they may not know about. But you know, an OMD, an IPG, they don't know this. They have no idea that that's the truth that you find in a Hispanic or in a multicultural shop.
Yeah,
Retail is, you bring up a good point. Retail's, I would put them in an ROI/performance.
Yeah.
100%.
And they're physically isolated or physically definable trade areas that a total market approach might gloss over. There might be individuals in that retail area who are exposed to the advertising, but not the mass of the market.
Yeah, I mean that market in Southgate or in Downey isn't really that impacted by the national advertising or even the statewide advertising that takes place. I mean, there might be some general awareness created for it, but you're not going to ultimately drive people in there unless you talk to them and engage them in the proper way. So you're absolutely right. Retail is one of these areas where you can actually very clearly measure the media spend and your creative spend.
But I guess I have a question, Patricia, because you hear these stories all the time, and how many of those stories are led by the champions that champion doing Hispanic and sticking to it, and then they leave, right? So I don't know if it was a leadership change, but that's the other thing that I'm still amazed by is the amount of people that go in and out of the market depending on whether there's somebody championing, championing.
Well,
multiple.
that's the I forget the word in English, precaria, of the Hispanic market. We're in a kind of an iffy situation always.
Yeah.
And we've been at this for how long? 30, 40 years? And we still can't seem to establish a business reason to invest properly in a Hispanic or in a multicultural initiative.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I mean, Lucia's right. I mean, I think for the examples of the Kaisers and a few other clients that I get a chance to work on, there are countless examples of those that have just glossed over the market and don't understand it, are making any effort to try to educate themselves and understand exactly where that opportunity might lie, and they just ignore it, and it's missed opportunities.
Yeah, we pitch a lot. We pitch our agency a lot, and there's answers that are very direct, and then there's always sort of between the line guessing at what's really behind this. But the kinds of reasons that we hear for not doing this, one of the number one reasons is we don't have the bandwidth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right? And we got to put all of our money into the total market because we're doing that anyways. The other one is that how do you address this market? How do we separate the attribution of Hispanic from the total? So they're very sort of technical / valid / boardroom safe answers. But the bottom line is you're still are you deliberately leaving a large segment of the market out of your prospect customer base. And if the Hispanic market profile is not right for your product, okay. If it doesn't fit your target market, no problem. There aren't very many categories I think that fit that anymore. It's 60 million plus people, and it's an entire country. But otherwise, why I ask, and if you're not comfortable answering, but there have to be other reasons that are related to bias that don't give permission to marketers to say, you know what, you're right. I don't care what we need to invest to at least explore this opportunity. And is it hurting us not to, at the very least?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hurting companies. I think it's hurting, shareholder value. There's no question about it. I mean, I think the smart marketers recognize the opportunity that's there, and those that are more focused on perhaps the bigger pie of the market are simply ignoring that opportunity. But that smaller opportunity, as they define it, can drive significant profit. There's been study after study, from Forrester to P&E studies that have suggested that there's shareholder value associated with companies that invest in the Hispanic market, and so you're just avoiding the facts that have been shown year after year to be opportunities.
And then there's the acculturation excuse, which is they're all speaking English.
Yeah.
They're all coming this way anyways.
Right, and because immigration is slightly down, there isn't this infusion of language and culture like it was maybe back in the 90s and early 2000s. Well, I think that's all hogwash. I mean, I think every single household that we know of is multi-generational, it's multiracial, and so I think that excuse is just really flimsy.
Well, it's interesting because in terms of some of the folks that led this total market movement a few years ago, included some pretty powerful marketers at the time. And what was interesting to me is the marketers and the buyers and the folks who, because our portfolio is more immigrant, foreign-born, Spanish-dominant. And the argument of, well, they're speaking English anyway, would come from marketers and media buyers who were the US-born, more acculturated Latino. So they would say, well, the rest of the market's just like me. Right. No, it's not. You should really do your homework in terms of, there's a dichotomy and very different, a marked difference between those two markets. But again, going back to the total market, it's like, oh, we can get all these folks with, the same creative, the same process, the same approach. I'm gonna, this is a question that nobody has been able to answer, and it's very clear. AIM says that only 5% of all spend is dedicated to multicultural marketing. So if you, like me, go to each of the agencies and just ask how many networks are in your consideration set, okay, as you invest in multicultural, and I would say Hispanic endemic media. That consideration set started to expand, and now it's contracted to the point where, and I've heard this from numerous agencies, where they'll say, I want a plan that includes Univision or Telemundo, or give me Telemundo because they're part of the NBC bundle.
That leads me to a question. Is the Comcast bundling of Telemundo and NBC properties, because there's Telemundo, Teleéxitos, and NBC has. So, do you think that that's going to be successful, or will it change the way that we do business?
Well, it's successful for them.
Yeah.
Well, no.
For sure.
Successful for them, for sure, you think?
It is, because you know what, when you have so many different assets, so it's the way we have multiple networks, right? And some networks might perform, some networks might not perform. For Telemundo, I think it's actually been detrimental, because Telemundo's being bundled, and I think it's been devalued. But as a company, of course it benefits them to have a Telemundo, to have a Universal, and to have multicultural.
But when it comes to monetizing Telemundo, does it benefit, or no? Because again, that's kind of the bundling or the total market approach.
There
it is.
It's
media.
No,
in
it's
today's
detrimental.
media environment, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but assuming that every Hispanic and every general market consumer had the potential of watching Telemundo and NBC properties, if you put those all together, what's their reach?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, is it 10%, 15? I mean, I'm sure they're not reaching 20% of the market. So if that's your strategy, then what about the rest of
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's detrimental to Telemundo, but it benefits the company to say, oh, we have these multicultural assets as part of the portfolio. That's my opinion.
And I think it's tied to the efficiencies that the company can achieve.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
But the interesting thing, though, is, I mean, to take the other side of the argument, if you're Univision, you're looking at this and saying, wow, I've seen my ratings actually decrease significantly over the last couple of years since there's been this merger. Is Telemundo tapped into something that Univision has not really, frankly, been able to market to? And that's probably more the bicultural audience, perhaps even the English language Hispanic. And so Telemundo does have properties that address that particular side of the market. Now, I would argue that's not the majority of the marketplace, but still a significant slice of the pie. So I would argue that
Also underserved.
Underserved, for sure. But I would argue that that merger has actually driven Telemundo numbers, even though I agree with you that it's devalued as part of an overall media proposition. I think if you look at Telemundo's ratings, they're significantly increased over the last couple of years at the detriment of a Univision. Now, there's lots of problems, perhaps the way Univision is programming and what they're offering, and maybe Telemundo's taking advantage of that, but clearly there has been some synergy that has worked in the marketplace.
Well, and part of the synergy, I think they've done a terrific job with, is if you're watching NBC and even go on their assets, they're embedding Telemundo promotion and segments, and so I think that's been a big part of why. But so
and that's to be lauded.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
NBC should be congratulated for taking a truly committed approach to the market.
Right. Agreed.
Well, and
regardless of how they package it later.
Yeah.
And a realization that that's actually what the market actually really looks like. Because I mean, the idea that Hispanics are only watching Spanish TV and then not watching English TV is just an outdated model. It's just not reality. So Telemundo and Universal have actually figured out how to tap that market and say, okay, we understand that we're seeing Spanish screens and English screens, and we're going to be able to deliver that to you in a more integrated way. So kudos to them for doing that. But still, there still needs to be some movement.
But I think, that's where I was leaning. I think the way that they're marketing themselves to the advertising community, again, is detrimental to the true multicultural market because they're trying to combine something that may not be combinable.
It's feeding a total market kind of
a total market philosophy.
That's why I'm saying it's going to be very hard to undo what's been kind of laid out now over the past few years. I don't know.
So let's go back to the original premise. Is there a pendulum? Can we get certain marketers to swing back to, forgetting about whether it's a boutique agency or a major agency, can we get them to swing back to a Hispanic segmentation approach? What is that going to take? I mean, I think there are two. You brought up the shareholder value, right? I think if you step outside of the culture wars and you look at the browning of the U.S. economy, not culture, economy, there's two indisputable facts. We're driving almost all population growth, immigrants, not just Hispanics, immigrants, almost all population growth, and over 25% of the GDP growth, right? So you take those two facts and you have to ask yourself, if you're a Fortune 500, 1,000, Inc. 5,000 company, why am I not talking to the market that's driving
the growth?
Yeah, the growth.
America's growth.
Right.
So what arguments do we make?
I mean, I always come down on the idea that when you're creating content to engage with the Hispanic consumer, it doesn't have to be in Spanish. It has to be culturally relevant and authentic and genuine. So whether that's in English or in Spanish, it's not really that's not really a strategy. That just becomes a vehicle how you're delivering that message. So you have to calibrate the campaign in a way so that it speaks to that market, that what I call the whole market, as opposed to simply a silo approach, for English language Hispanics and then Spanish language Hispanics. So I think at the end of the day, it's a more calibrated approach that's ultimately going to drive that pendulum switch back to something that's a little bit more realistic and less siloed.
So I'm going to give you my perspective, and it goes back to a comment that I made earlier. So, I started with Hemisphere, so it's been 4 years. I started 4 years ago with an account list of 70 advertisers, okay? And the way I qualify those advertisers are they doing Hispanic? Because, we're not Univision, we're not Telemundo, so I'm not going to go after those that I have to convince to do Hispanic, like the pharma business. Right. So here are the 70 accounts. Who's doing Hispanic television and spending a sizable amount that would consider me, right? So I started eliminating, so it's like 50 accounts, okay? I am down to, and this is the traditional accounts, I am down to 15 accounts, okay? For Senior Latino, it's down to now 5 accounts because Nielsen is the #1, right? And 5 accounts, I mean, like a P&G has multiple advertisers, right? Clorox has multiple advertisers. But if you talk about those parent companies, I'm probably down to 5 accounts. So what I've decided to do is let me focus on those 5 accounts. I'm gonna super serve them. I'm gonna offer sponsorship packages. I'm gonna break out new products but I'm done with this list. And I'm going now for these, we have about 4 direct response, you could call them, advertisers that don't necessarily just look at Nielsen, they look at Nielsen and ComScore. A couple of them are small business targets, and they're like, small business is being driven by Latinos, right. And I'm doing strategic partnerships with them, and I am now doing strategic partnerships with clients that get it, and that I don't have to be convincing about, educating and doing all this, and it's more about implementation. So it's very targeted, but that number of clients in the traditional bucket, I think it's declining.
All right, so on that really hopeful note.
But it's exciting because think about the strategic partnerships you could do with
but I think
10,
I think you bring up an interesting insight. There's a total market approach, and then there's a whole market reality, whatever that is, right? So I agree with you, and we often say that Hispanic advertising is not defined by Spanish language advertising. It's most of what we do, but it's all really about communicating in culture fundamentally. Right. But at the end of the day, content comes down to a language. It's communicating in a language. It's either in English or in Spanish or in Mandarin,
some sort of
or
combination.
Some kind of language. And what I like about the whole market idea is that ultimately you have to look at each bucket if it's large enough to make an investment in. And I would argue that the Spanish language bucket is more than large enough. The bilingual, bicultural bucket in and of itself that you could reach in 2 languages is in and of itself is huge. And then the English-speaking Hispanic is a large bucket. So, but the total market approach can't reach all of them. No. You have to really set aside. You really have to set aside 3 lines in your strategy and your mission statement to say this. This is what I'm.
Right.
But if you look at P&G as an example, and they have, I guess, hundreds of brands, right? But there's probably 25 that are active in Hispanic because those are the brands that they know that like Tide. You see the research over and over again. Tide is driving sales for that brand. Of course, I think it's very specific. So, in terms of total market and the cultural insights and all of that, I think that's more a discussion for clients that are already doing it. I'm more talking about clients, the fact that we have less clients that are doing it. Yeah. And how do we convince clients to do it? And that's what I'm saying about, I think we need to go to these other brands that have not necessarily been active and start from scratch.
It's almost, it almost then comes full circle because to us, to kind of a performance marketing perspective, because the successful marketers are those who know who their, to use a TV term, is their audiences. And like the P&Gs, like the Kaisers, and those will ultimately be successful. Whereas, a brand that is, I'm reaching them because I'm doing total market. Yeah, they may be reaching on a superficial basis. Yeah, they may be reaching everybody. They're not reaching them effectively.
Yeah, I mean, you're driving awareness perhaps, but you're not driving engagement. And at the end of the day, my business is proven based on engagement and the level of engagement that we can produce. And you only produce that engagement if there's some truth to it, right, into your brand promise. If you can create the proper truth and then measure it against the proper media spend, that's ultimately you're going to create, that kind of engagement and activation.
And I'm speaking from a revenue growth perspective. The majority of my revenue growth is not coming from the traditional. It's coming from the performance marketing clients.
And I don't think that should be a bad word, because traditionally we keep thinking performance-driven marketing is against branding, but it's not. They can coexist very successfully together. In fact, they should coexist in order for the whole to be successful.
Yeah.
So we're going to end there. We'll invite our listeners to interact with us. We'll be putting each of our email addresses up in the credits of the show. So if you want to reach out to Lucia or Armando directly, or Patricia or I, please feel free.
No hate emails, please.
We have community managers. So
Exactly, please.
Yes.
So.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.